Long ago, two cities flourished in the wilderness, Sodom and Gomorrah, prosperous but consumed by darkness. Their people lived in luxury, but also in sin. And then, the heavens opened. Two messengers came with a warning: flee or perish. But not everyone was able to abandon the past. What happens when we ignore the warnings? When judgment falls, there is no escape. Divine justice cannot be defied. This is the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, a story of sin, judgment, and fateful choices. The scene of sin and corruption. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were known for their wealth and prosperity, but also for the extreme wickedness of their inhabitants. The residents indulged in depraved behavior, completely ignoring the teachings of justice and goodness. In the midst of this decadence lived Lot, a righteous man who, despite everything, remained faithful to God. He, his wife, and his daughters lived in Sodom, closely observing the corruption that grew around them. Sodom, with its bustling streets and luxurious palaces, hid true moral rot. It was a city where selfishness, greed, and immorality ruled, and God's laws were treated with contempt. Chapter 1. Sodom and Gomorrah, Cities of Sin. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah had become symbols of wealth and opulence. Their markets were filled with exotic goods brought by merchants who crossed the desert, and their streets, always bustling, pulsated with the frenzy of commerce and urban life. However, behind the facade of prosperity, there was a deep moral corruption. The inhabitants indulged in excessive pleasures and practices that contravened God's laws. Greed, injustice, and violence prevailed. Compassion and righteousness, once praised, became objects of derision. Among this rabble lived Lot, a righteous man. Although he and his family resided in Sodom, his heart was far from the abominations that occurred there. Lot knew that the city around him was on a path of no return, about to reap the consequences of its wickedness. He was often tormented by the behavior of the inhabitants, who scoffed at any kind of morality. But even as a stranger among his own neighbors, Lot maintained his faithfulness to God, hoping that somehow the city could be saved. With each passing day, Sodom seemed to sink deeper into its abyss of depravity. Parties stretched into the night, dishonest trade flourished, and violence raged unpunished in the streets. Lot, with the weight of justice on his heart, watched the decay without being able to do much to change it. Unbeknownst to the city's inhabitants, the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah had already reached the heavens. God, in his justice, decided that the city's time was coming to an end. The corruption that dominated its inhabitants had exceeded all limits, and punishment was about to be meted out. However, before the destruction came, messengers would be sent with one final warning. And so, while the city continued its disorderly life, destiny began to move in the direction of Lot and his family. Chapter 2. The arrival of God's messengers. While the city of Sodom was still immersed in its sins, two divine messengers descended to the land. They arrived discreetly, as simple travelers, hiding their true nature. At sunset, they entered the city gates. Lot, who was sitting near the entrance, saw them, and immediately something in his spirit alerted him that these men were not mere strangers. With a deep sense of hospitality and respect, Lot hurried to welcome them. "My lords, please come to my house," he said reverently. "Stay with me tonight and wash your feet. In the morning you may go on your way." The men hesitated, suggesting that they could spend the night in the town square, but Lot insisted. He knew the danger that lurked in the dark streets of Sodom, especially for strangers. The visitors accepted the invitation, and Lot prepared a simple feast for them. But before they could rest, a commotion began to form outside. A group of men from the town from all over surrounded Lot's house, banging on the door loudly. The violence and immorality of the inhabitants was now on full display. "Bring these men out so we can meet them," they shouted in unison, their voices thick with malice. Lot, fearing for the safety of his visitors, went out to face the crowd, closing the door behind him. "My brothers, please don't do this wicked thing," he pleaded. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The angry mob threatened to storm the house. Then the messengers intervened. Opening the door, they pulled Lot back inside and, with a gesture of divine power, blinded the men surrounding them. Confused and terrified, the attackers stumbled through the streets, unable to see. Inside the house, the angels revealed the true reason for their visit. God had decided to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. The wickedness of the cities was undeniable, and divine judgment was coming. Yet because of Lot's righteousness, he and his family would be spared, but they would need to flee without delay. Destruction was imminent. They had only one chance to escape. Chapter 3. The warning and the urgency of escape. Still stunned by the events of the night, Lot could barely absorb the weight of the messenger's words. God's sentence was clear. Sodom and Gomorrah would be destroyed by dawn. He, however, would have a chance to escape with his family, but there was one severe condition. When they fled, they could not look back. Any hesitation, any clinging to the past, would seal their fate alongside the wicked. Time was running out. The silence that enveloped Lot's house after the crowd had dispersed was deceptive, for chaos was already beginning to take shape. What was approaching was divine judgment, and the city, still immersed in its sins, remained unaware of the disaster that was about to fall upon it. With urgency, Lot went to his sons-in-law, his daughter's fiancés, to warn them. "Hurry, get out of this city, for the Lord is going to destroy it," he pleaded. However, his words were met with disdain. To them, it sounded like an absurd delusion. Laughing, they refused to follow him, not believing that anything could happen to them or to the city. Lot's heart sank with pain, but he could not waste time. Back at home, the angels insisted that he leave immediately. At dawn, the punishment would begin. Lot, still hesitant, tried to gain time. It was difficult to leave behind everything he had built, his entire past. But the messengers were relentless. They grabbed Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters by the hands and hurried them out of the city. "Flee for your lives," they ordered, pointing to the mountains. As they ran, the messengers reinforced their final warning. Do not look back, do not stop, do not waver. The only chance of survival was to keep going, without regret or nostalgia for Sodom. The sun was beginning to rise over the horizon, but dark clouds of destruction were already hovering over the city. Lot and his family ran for their lives, leaving behind their home, their friends, and a city that would soon be nothing more than ashes. Chapter 4. The Escape and Sin of Lot's Wife. The hot wind blew harder as Lot, his wife, and his daughters ran away from Sodom. The path to the mountains was steep and barren, and fear drove their steps. The sky, once lit by the rising sun, now darkened with thick clouds, heralding the imminent end of the city. As they walked away, the sound of destruction began to echo behind them, the roar of fire and brimstone falling from the sky, accompanied by violent tremors that shook the earth. The angel's warning echoed in everyone's minds. Do not look back. God's judgment was already underway, and there was no time for hesitation or regret. Each step they took brought them closer to safety and closer to certain death, but it also represented a complete abandonment of the life they knew. The destruction of Sodom meant not only the loss of a city, but also the severing of any emotional connection with the past. Despite the terror that drove them forward, Lot's wife was overcome by a wave of uncertainty. Each step she took into the unknown increased her attachment to what she was leaving behind. The pain of leaving her home, her belongings, and her life in Sodom grew stronger by the second. The sound of explosions behind her became unbearable, and her curiosity, or perhaps longing, was overwhelming. Ignoring the warning that had been given by the angels, she gave in. She looked back. The instant her eyes gazed at the burning city, her body stiffened. Suddenly, it was as if time had stopped. Her feet, which had previously been running, were now immobilized. Her arms and legs turned to stone, and her skin, which had been alive, turned to salt. There, in the middle of the desert, Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt, frozen forever in the moment of her disobedience. Lot and his daughters kept running, not immediately realizing the tragic fate of the woman they had left behind. When they realized it, it was too late. She was no longer with them. Sodom's punishment was not just about the fire that consumed the city, but about the inability to let go of the past. By looking back, Lot's wife chose what she should have left behind, and the price for it was her own life. As the city continued to be engulfed in flames, her fate was sealed. Like a pillar of salt, she had become an eternal reminder of disobedience and the fatality of looking back. Chapter 5: The total destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. As Lot and his daughters continued their desperate flight toward the mountains, a devastating silence fell upon them, broken only by the distant sounds of the catastrophe that consumed Sodom and Gomorrah. The sky, which had been blue, was now covered by dense black clouds, illuminated by flashes of fire and sparks of sulfur. From the horizon, they could see smoke rising like a giant column, obscuring the sun and spreading the acrid smell of destruction through the air. The cities that had been prosperous and full of life were now in ruins. The intense heat of the divine fire reduced everything to ashes. Houses, temples, marketplaces, and even the surrounding fields were engulfed in flames. The ground trembled, cracking under the weight of divine wrath, as torrents of fire fell relentlessly from the sky. Sodom and Gomorrah, in a matter of hours, went from centers of wealth to mere deserts of ash and destruction. There was no life, no memory of the glory they had once held. From a distance, Lot and his daughters stood watching the scene unfold. What they saw was the complete end of a civilization. Everything that had been built, everything that the people had valued so much, was now disappearing under God's judgment. The landscape around them was transformed. The fertile beauty of the Jordan Valley had given way to a vast expanse of desolation and devastation. It was as if the cities had never existed. Lot's silent grief weighed heavily on his shoulders. He had lost not only his home and possessions, but also his wife. Unlike the city, she had not been consumed by fire, but her fate was no less tragic. The pillar of salt that represented her now stood as a testament to her fateful choice to look back, an eternal symbol of the price of disobedience. As the destruction continued, the sound of explosions and the crackling of flames echoed in the air. The heat of the ruined cities could be felt even from a distance. Sodom and Gomorrah, once great urban centers, would disappear forever, buried by a divine calamity that no one would be able to forget. Lot's eyes were still fixed on the horizon, where his life had once flourished. Now, all he could do was keep walking. He and his daughters had no choice but to press on, into the unknown, carrying the bitter memory of all they had lost and the weight of God's justice. Chapter 6: Consequences and Reflection on Divine Justice. After the total destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his daughters found refuge in the mountains, far from the smoking ruins. The silence around them was absolute, as if the world itself had stopped in respect for the judgment that had just taken place. The dust raised by divine fury began to settle, leaving only the void that now filled the place where the cities had stood. The weight of the tragedy fell on Lot's shoulders. He had not only lost his wife, but also the city he called home. The loss was profound and irreversible, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Memories of the past haunted him, but he had survived. He had been spared not by his own merit, but by the mercy of God. The transformation of his wife into a pillar of salt was a constant reminder of the importance of obedience and the severity of divine justice. She, who could not resist the temptation to look back, had paid with her own life. His disobedience had been fatal, and his frozen figure served as an eternal warning. There is no future for those who insist on clinging to what has been condemned. As Lot reflected on these events, he realized that God was righteous in his decision. The unbridled wickedness of Sodom and Gomorrah had surpassed all limits, and the judgment that had fallen upon the cities was inevitable. Sin brought its consequences, and the cities became an example of the destruction that comes to those who reject righteousness and justice. For Lot and his daughters, the future was uncertain. Everything they had known was gone, and the only thing left for them to do was move forward. The lesson learned was clear. Sometimes the past must be left behind completely. Disobedience to this principle had cost the lives of many, including Lot's wife. With the cities now turned to ashes and his family reduced to nothing, Lot recognized the power of divine judgment. At the same time, he felt the weight of the mercy that had been shown them. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah was not just a tale of destruction, but a powerful reminder of justice and the importance of following God's instructions. Those who look back, as his wife had done, become trapped in the past and are destroyed by it. Only those who move forward, despite hardship and loss, can find redemption. Looking toward the mountain horizon, Lot knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he had been spared for a greater purpose. With his daughters by his side, he began to rebuild his life, knowing that God's true justice had prevailed, and that for those who obey, there is always a chance to start over. The path of obedience and divine protection. As Lot and his daughters moved forward, they knew that everything had changed. Their cities, their wealth, and the life they had known were lost forever. But in the midst of the destruction, one truth shone clearly: God had delivered them. They were not spared by chance. The Lord guided them, warned them, and through obedience, they escaped the fate of the doomed city. Each step into the unknown was a step entrusted to God's plan. He not only delivered them from judgment, but he kept them for a future that only he could see. The story of Lot and his family reminds us of an eternal lesson. Obedience to God is the path to salvation. Amidst the chaos, the temptation to look back, and the difficulties of life, it is our faithfulness to him that sets us free. When we trust his instructions, even if we don't understand everything, he keeps us from the evil we cannot foresee. God never abandons his own. Through obedience, he leads us along the right path and delivers us from all danger. Just as he did with Lot, he continues to protect and guide those who listen to his voice and follow his will.